Ajahn Kunadhammo is going to lead a day long at Spirit Rock tomorrow on the first noble truth, understanding suffering. And I think, if I remember right, the last talk that I gave was about faith, and among other things, I mentioned the qualities of mundane right view. But it's interesting to notice that in the Noble Eightfold Path, believe the most common definition of right view is simply the Four Noble Truths. So when we chant the recollection of the Eightfold Path in the chanting book, it's and what bhikkhus is right view, knowledge of dukkha, knowledge of the cause of dukkha, knowledge of the cessation of dukkha, and knowledge of the path leading to the cessation of dukkha. And this is how this bhikkhus is right view. So there's those. So both definitions of right view appear in the suttas, and I think that it's later. I think it postdates the suttas, but somebody started calling them mundane right view and supermundane right view, which is it's definitely a useful distinction, so as not to get them confused. But yeah, I thought I would talk a bit about the Four Noble Truths. First, the one question that arises when you hear that definition of right view is that it sounds noticeably different from the description of mundane right view. When someone asks, well, what do Buddhists believe? You could say, the answer to mundane right view, well, generosity is beneficial. We have a special relationship with our parents, and in particular, actions bear fruit based on the ethical quality of the intentions that they're carried out with. This sounds like an answer to what do Buddhists believe. You tell them that, and that'd probably satisfy them. If you said, well, what do Buddhists believe? I mean, I guess, in some ways, if you say, well, there's suffering, and there's an origin of suffering, and there's a cessation and a path. That sounds, it's different than the kind of dogmas that, it's different than sort of this is different than the Apostles' Creed. And it requires more, how do we use it? What does it mean? And one book that I read recently it did even call it the Four Noble Truths, because it was not a book explicitly or about Buddhism, at least, but it was talking about the author used the metaphor of a stress compass. In other words, how do we use the experience of stress or dukkha to guide our lives? And that's the question that the Four Noble Truths answer, at least on one level, on a experiential level that one can access pretty immediately. How do we... And it's also important to recognize what this is in contradistinction to. We ordinarily guide our lives by a story about me, me and mine. Me, what I like, what I don't like, what I have, what I want to get, who my friends are, who my enemies are, where I live, and so on. And that's what's really real to us. So taking the Four Noble Truths on is replacing that with what is the experience of dukkha right now? And one doesn't need, you put aside the references to a self and a world. Right now, what is there dukkha? Is something, is there a sense of unsatisfactoriness? But no need to put it in terms of a world or a self. And then what's the cause? And here, the definition of the second noble truth frames the cause in terms of it is that craving bound up with delight and lust, delighting now here, now there, craving for sense pleasure, craving for existence, and craving for annihilation. But again, it doesn't refer to who craves. It's not about me craving. It's about a mental factor. And sometimes the Buddha makes this fairly explicit. But one also has to recognize that there are times when it is very useful to think about, one's identity, one's self, and whether one is or isn't craving. But ultimately, there are times and contexts where that's skillful. And there are times and contexts where it's not. And one of those times was the Buddha was, I forget if it was at Savatthi or unspecified, but the Buddha was teaching dependent origination. And after he went through with ignorance as conditioned mental formations, with mental formations as conditioned consciousness, and so on, with becoming as conditioned birth, with birth as conditioned old age, sickness, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. Well, then some monk, Anjalid, raised his hand and said, well, what Lord is this birth? What Lord is this aging and death? And for whom is there this aging and death? And he asked a whole bunch of other questions too, and I'll skip ahead to the what Venerable Sir is this craving, and for whom is there this craving? And the Buddha replied, not a valid question. The factor of craving in dependent origination is with feeling as conditioned craving. So in response to that, what now is this craving, and for whom is there this craving? And the Buddha replies, whether not a valid question, whether one says, what now is this craving, and for whom is there this craving, or one says, craving is one thing, and the one who craves another, these statements are identical in meaning. They differ only in the phrasing. And he goes on to explain more. If one says the life principle and the body are identical, then there is no living of the holy life. If one says the life principle and the body the life principle is one thing, the body is another, there's no living of the holy life. And by that he means you can't wake up if you hold either of those views. Without veering towards either of these extremes, the Tathagata teaches the Dhamma by the middle, with feeling as conditioned craving. And so, again, pointing in this case very explicitly, and it's important to recognize that this was in the context of his teachings on dependent origination, but leaving out that self-reference. And it's useful to really get an experiential sense of how much we like that self-reference, how much craving, how much, again, bhava tanha, craving to become. Tell me a story about myself. And even if it's a crummy story, you can still feel that there's something desirable about it. And this can go on and on and on and on. And it will unless we do something about it. So this is where bringing things back to the experience of stress and the cessation of stress is so helpful. Taking us out of that realm of me and my stuff and my friends. And this can be very simple. Just, for example, different people's minds have different tendencies, but my mind very much craves security. And bhava tanha, the story is so, I want to find some sort of story that makes me secure. And it's endless, because there isn't any security in the conditioned realm. And you can't, but the problem is that we don't have the skill to step from just jump to what isn't conditioned. Just have no idea how to do that. So we have to train ourselves, and it takes a long time. But one step that one can just investigate is There's the security of, the knowledge of what the knowledge feels like, of just whether one is knowing. Breathing in, one knows one's breathing in. Breathing out, one knows one's breathing out. It's the very first bit of the Anapanasati instructions. But one can recognize what kind of knowing is that. And that's actually, it is only a small modicum of security. But at the same time, there's a certainty to knowing whether one is breathing in or breathing out. And in reality, that's more certain in the stories we tell about ourselves, which are continuously subject to modification and change, and it's pretty clear that they're quite biased stories. We can't trust ourselves. But breathing in, breathing out, yep, can do that. So that's a way to, again, use these principles just to begin to settle the mind so we can see things more clearly. And because to the agitated mind, none of this makes sense. There's no way to read that stress compass. If you're spinning around dizzy, you can't tell which way is which. And so often that's our habit. One of the things, the Four Noble Truths are so central that the forest masters of Thailand have come up with several different ways of stating them, because it's useful just to keep taking a fresh look at these. One that when I was looking through some teachings, looking for the Four Noble Truths, I found that Ajahn Lee had written a description of the Four Noble Truths in his book, The Basic Themes. And Ajahn Lee's a bit unique among the earlier generation of the forest teachers in that he actually wrote things, and it was rare that, my understanding, it was rare for most of the first couple generations of Thai forest monks to write much. Ajahn Chah didn't write much, for example. But Ajahn Lee wrote this down, and Ajahn Jeff translated it. If we were asked to state the Four Noble Truths in brief, we could do so as follows. The moods and preoccupations of the mind that arise and cease are the noble truth of stress. The mental act that deludedly enters into and takes the mental act that deludedly enters into and takes possession of these states is the noble truth of the origin of stress. The mental act that focuses on these states and examines them as they arise and cease is the noble truth of the path. The mental act that abandons the mental act that abandons these states the mental act that lets go of these states as they arise and cease is the truth of cessation or release. In other words, that which knows the reality that is beyond, that which knows the reality that does not arise and does not cease. And I don't think I quite have that. That's not quite what's written. Made a few mistakes there, I think. But still, just to have, it's useful to investigate these. Again, the sense of the path as investigating what's going on right now. And there's a security there to actually know what's happening now, and whether it's stressful or not, and whether it leads to stress or away from stress. And there's a simplicity there, in that one can set aside all those stories about the self and the world. And this takes practice, and it takes a willingness to be with what arises and ceases. And sometimes, as it noted, sometimes it's stressful, and sometimes it's boring, and oftentimes there's part of the mind that would really rather just dive into some object or another. But eventually, one has enough experience, it's like, okay, I know where that one goes. Let's go a different direction. That leads to suffering. And much of our training is making these feedback loops more immediate. So, you've probably, I think it's a fairly common experience to be addicted to something, whether major or minor, and after we've done it enough times, we certainly know the results. I was, for instance, even for the couple of years before I came to the monastery, I knew I wanted to come here, and pretty diligent in my meditation practice. But every couple months I would just go on, play this one video game for, say, 6 hours a day for, 3-4 days straight before I finally gave up on it. And I certainly knew enough to know that brought suffering. but I didn't know that well enough not to do it again. And so, I know those cravings were very much still there when I came here, and sometimes I still think about that game mentally. But and when I was first here, there were times when I would even think about, well, maybe I could sneak off with one of the laptop computers. And this game is really it's available almost everywhere. I mean, you can play it on any kind of computer, and it requires very little hardware. And so maybe I'll just sneak off with one of the laptop computers, and nobody will notice. But I knew that wasn't a good idea, and I didn't do it. And I remember when I finally knew I couldn't I could never do that, was when the community made me computer administrator. Now I could have snuck off with that laptop if I'd wanted to, and I probably could have gotten away with it even more easily. Since I was a computer administrator, people probably assume I had a good reason to be using that laptop. But my reflection was, no, I'd have to admit that, and then they'd have to find another computer administrator. And, that'd be a real disappointment for the community. And at that, when I had that reflection, I knew, yep, that's not gonna happen. And then my whole relationship to those thoughts changed, because now it was totally out of the realm of possibility that I was actually going to play that game. And so that's so much of what our practice is that we have a theoretical understanding of the long-term consequences of our actions. But how do we make that immediate enough so that we actually make the choices that will lead to the long-term happiness that we want? And there's no one answer. This requires creativity and skill. You can learn things from other people's experience. You can take other people's advice, but in reality, you have to learn what is it that works for you. And and there's no guarantees that it will not keep changing. But there really isn't any alternative to just keep paying attention to the results, keep practicing, and keep refining that stress compass, where what actions will lead to long-term well-being, and how do I make the feedback immediate enough that I'm able to make those choices instead of making choices that I know will hurt me in the long run. And so this is the practice that's sort of right in front of our noses. But also for myself, I find it, I should say, some of this goes very much against the grain for me. I'm very happy to think a lot. I like thinking, and I taught myself. Now I look back at my childhood, and when other people were playing outside in recess, I was outside, but I was sitting there reading a book about how to program in Pascal. This is 4th grade. And, the book was for adults, but, nobody told me that. And in Montessori, they just sort of, they let children sort of do whatever children want to do. And so I read my book on Pascal, and I learned it. And it wasn't that I definitely had plenty of access to outside. I was very, very fortunate that way as a child. But when I lived in Tucson, my brother and I would go hiking through the Sonora, what is it? The desert, the Sonoran Desert. It would have been Saguaro National Monument East was within biking distance of our house, so we could go hike in a place where there were the big saguaro cacti, and you could walk through them. And I remember one summer I made a commitment I was going to hike every trail, and it was on the map. So I had my highlighter and my map, and my brother and I, about 2 or 3 times a week, would start trekking out there, highlighting our trails. And it was great being outside, but simultaneously I was teaching my brother how to program computers, even though we were walking through the desert. At that point and so I taught myself how to be doing one thing and thinking about something totally abstract and different. And I never, nobody ever told me, this will make it really tough to meditate, don't do that. And in reality, I was meditating half an hour a day at about that time. But I never quite made the connection, even though I could definitely, I mean, if you start meditating, you start learning about your cravings, because they'll come up, and they did. Well, anyway, so now I have to unlearn all this stuff, and it's a real challenge. And I imagine other people with different personalities, have different challenges. So I think it's important to recognize that this is work that we have to do. Because, for instance, in the career choice world, they would say, well, just go with your strengths. If you think like that, find a job where thinking like that's okay, where it's helpful. But bhikkhu is not a job where thinking like that is helpful. But I'm committed to be here, and so you have to understand what the significant rewards of this are. Otherwise, you won't do it. So it's very useful to recognize where these Four Noble Truths eventually lead. So there's in Ajahn Sumedho's book about the Four Noble Truths, it's about midway through the chapter on the fourth Noble Truth, and this has been reprinted in the book, in the first volume of the Ajahn Sumedho anthology. But he describes where the Eightfold Path and right view eventually lead. There is a sequence leading to right understanding, namely understanding that everything that arises, everything that is subject to arising is subject to ceasing and is not self. With right understanding, you have given up the illusion of a self that is connected to mortal conditions. There is still the body, there are still feelings and thoughts, but they simply are what they are. You no longer believe that you are your body or your feelings or your thoughts. The emphasis is on things are what they are. We are not trying to say that things are not anything at all, or that they are not what they are. They are exactly what they are, and nothing more. But when we are ignorant, when we have not understood these truths, then we tend then we tend to think that things are more than what they are. We believe all kinds of things and create all kinds of problems around the conditions that we experience. So much of human anguish and despair is based on the added extra that is born of delusion in the moment, born of ignorance in the moment. It is sad to realize how the misery and anguish and despair of humanity is based upon delusion. The despair is empty and meaningless. When you understand this, you begin to feel infinite compassion for all beings. That's quite a statement, going from the understanding what happens when one really internalizes these teachings on impermanence and not self. And I think it's really notable that from the perspective of one who understands, existential despair is meaningless. Whereas for one who is despairing, the world seems meaningless, but you flip it around. And I can remember when I was younger, I was so looking for a spiritual reality that would make everything okay. And I so much feared that it wasn't there either. But here Ajahn Sumedho is saying that actually it's our ordinary perception of things that is overly complicated. It's not that we're trying to find something beyond what we experience, but to actually see what we experience correctly and drop the false assumptions that we're making. And the result of that is, very clear seeing. And right there is the security that I really want. But at the same time, it's totally clear that there isn't. The way I usually seek security is by trying to be a person who somehow has the attributes to make this person secure. But in reality, there's security, but no person, or no one who is secure. My understanding is that, you don't find an identity apart from the act of identification. And the world is simpler and more peaceful the less that act of identification happens. It doesn't mean that you use it when it's appropriate and drop it when it's not. But there isn't the belief that it has to be this way. One sees that process. So again, so one takes that vision of where things are leading, and one brings it right back to, okay, right now, let's see if we can find security in knowing that the breath is coming in and the breath is going out. And that's our meditation tonight. So I offer this for your reflection. Sadhu, 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 anumodami.
So this is our observance night, and have the opportunity to continue practicing.